And I'm going to share my screen with you guys.
The lady just talked to me.
Yeah, my computer just yelled at me.
Yeah, she wanted you to know you were being recorded. All right. Can you guys see my PowerPoint?
No.
You can't? Okay, I did something. Hang on. Usually pretty good at this. Oh, yeah, that's because I didn't push the share button. That would help. Now, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, the information we're about to talk about, my dog stopped. Quiet. Sorry, that was for her, not you. Is all background information that hopefully will help Romeo and Juliet make a little more sense and give you more ways you can respond to it. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So we're going to start by talking about just some ideas that are important and is associated with Elizabethan England, associated with this time and place in history, which we just barely touched on yesterday. So this does not mean that you have to necessarily have full, deep understanding of all of these terms. I just want these terms to be words you've heard before and have some sense of what they might have to do with, because we could come back and use them to apply them to the play a little bit later. So the first thing is the term Renaissance, the Renaissance. Have you guys heard Renaissance before?
Yeah.
History or any? Okay.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So the Renaissance in Europe in the 1600s is a period of time that's often looked at as a literary period, but it's also artistic, and it takes into account a lot of things. But the idea is that Renaissance means rebirth. So it is this revival of interest in much earlier ideas. So in this class, we have just recently studied ancient Greek theater. Among things that were happening in the Renaissance is that the dramatists, the people who are writing and performing plays, were looking for ways to kind of throw back to the early Greek dramas and borrow or use elements from them in their versions. So that's one thing we can think about, since we've had the benefit of reading Medea very recently and talking about Greek drama, is what are some ways that Shakespeare's plays are similar to or different than that early Greek drama? How is he in some ways throwing back to that? All right. Humanism is another concept that is strongly associated with Elizabethan England. And this is kind of an idea that is becoming more popular in this time period. And humanism is the belief that human needs and values are more important than religious beliefs. Now, this doesn't mean that people are anti-religious. This doesn't mean that people don't have religion. Elizabethan England is still a very religious place, but it's kind of this shift from everything is about religion to, hey, like, people can sort of decide things for themselves. They can have their own sets of ethics that are maybe separate from or in addition to what okay, somebody's writing on my screen. To what, I don't know how you're doing that, but if you're doing that, please stop. In addition to what religion is telling them. Sorry, I had to pop somebody in here. All right, the Reformation is another term associated with this time in history, and is this idea that basically the Catholic Church needs to be reformed. We talked just briefly yesterday about how Catholicism was the way in England previous to this, and now Queen Elizabeth is Protestant, but there are people who are saying, hey, we just need to kind of improve the Catholic Church. If it's going to stick around, it needs to be better than it was. So that is a concept that's going on as well. Any questions?
No.
No, that's pretty easy.
All right, just making sure. Okay.
You could probably erase all that writing if you do like share screen. And then you can do like an eraser and like erase it all.
Yeah, I can't do it at the same time.
Okay.
So if you, I don't even
I don't know how you do that.
I don't know how you do
My
it
name is
either.
Griff.
I don't even
I'm
think
not
there's an
mad, just don't
option
do it
to-
again.
Look at Griffin, man.
Okay. All right, so excuse me. The other three things I want to mention under this section of important ideas: nationalism, which again is a word you've probably heard somewhere in your social studies classes. It's this idea that you identify with your own nation and you support your own nation's interests, and maybe to the extent that you don't support any other nation's ideas. So it's not the same thing as patriotism. Patriotism is pride in your country, but nationalism is like a more extreme form of that, to where you're basically like, my nation is great and everybody else stinks. So that idea of being really having a sense of nationhood and a sense that where you live is better than other places is sort of becoming an emerging idea. There's a lot of new discoveries in this time period. Along with the Renaissance, there's a lot of world exploration, increased trade, scientific experimentation. There are a lot of new foods that are coming into the country as a result of increased trade. We know that America is about to be settled, in the early 1600s is when we're going to start to have the Pilgrims and the Puritans going over to America. So this is right at the edge of that. And then printing and education advancements. And just very simply, the printing press comes along in the late 1400s. And so throughout the 16th century, you're getting more and more things being printed. And the fact that you have more printing, you have pamphlets and books, and everybody's not having to have a monk copy things out by hand. You can actually reproduce a whole bunch of writing at one time, is making it easier for more people to get educated and to learn how to read, because there's more to read available. And so in particular, the middle class, so people who are not necessarily on the highest end of society, which would have been the only people who got to go to school and learn to read earlier, and not necessarily the poorest classes, but that large middle class is now being able to go to school and get access to more. That's really important for Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is middle class. He is able to go to grammar school, get a pretty great education, as someone who lives in a village and whose father is a trade worker. And the fact that he was able to read and had access to books is probably how he learned a lot of what he did and put into his play. Okay. All right. So these are just a couple of things. I honestly did not want to overwhelm you. I just kind of cherry picked a few things about Elizabethan culture that I thought might be interesting and relevant, just from different aspects of this time period. One, I've said this twice already. Protestantism is the way. That is the main religion, but Catholicism is tolerated. So that's important. Two, migration from country to city life is becoming more prominent, meaning you've got more people moving into the cities. You've got a lot of different kinds of people in the city. You have more interesting mixes of different types of life going on. Three, trades and skills are passed through families and by apprenticeship, which means if your father is a glove maker, there's a good chance you're going to be a glove maker. And if you don't want to be a glove maker, the only chance you have of having a different career is probably if you go find somebody else who has the skill you want and get them to let you be their apprentice. You didn't have tons of options about how to live your life and how to make money. Guys, if you're changing your screen in order to be distracting to your classmates, it's really not productive. And I'd hate to have to kick you out. So please fix it if it's currently distracting. Thank you to those of you who are taking this seriously. All right. A couple other things. You may have seen some of this depicted in movies if you've seen anything set during this time period. But during Elizabethan times, crimes were met with violent and cruel punishments, torture, public executions. If you go to castles in England now, you can still tour the dungeons where they have a lot of this torture equipment still available.
Griffin is not me.
Okay. Yeah, clearly that's somebody who shouldn't have been here. Okay. So, you know, this is people getting their heads chopped off or being hung in public. I mean, that's the culture. And as more people are going into the cities, there's more crimes and pickpocketing and things like that happening. And so they're taking a really harsh stance on that. Leisure is actually becoming something that exists for people. If you're working out in the villages or in the country, you're working hard from sun up to sundown. There is no such thing as leisure time. But as people are moving into the cities and they're working trades, it now becomes possible that they may be able to take an afternoon off and go to a play or do something like that. So the increase in theater going is happening during this time. And despite all of these advances, there is still a very rigid class structure. So that means basically your nobility, your middle class, your poor, you know, you're very clearly defined, and the government is set up in such a way that it's going to enforce not only that you stay in your class, but that your class is very easily recognizable to other people. There was something called sumptuary clothing laws. Basically, there were laws that said what you could and could not wear. And it would go to things like colors. You know, you could only maybe wear certain colors depending on the class you were in, or maybe what rank of nobility you were. Sometimes even the fabrics and materials were limited. Only certain people could wear certain fabrics, even the styles of clothing. I don't know how interesting you find this, but I always found this fascinating. This is, of course, a time when women are wearing the large dresses, right? And of course, they may be very low cut. They may be showing a lot of chest, but they were not supposed to be showing their legs at all. And so women wearing pants was actually an offense that could get you in jail or even executed, because you were seen to be as profane or offensive or lewd if you were a woman who was showing off that she had legs. And in fact, the only women who were known to actually wear pants were prostitutes, because that was how they drew attention to themselves, by pointing out that they had two legs, which is kind of funny to think about today, I guess. That was what was considered really loose behavior, wearing pants. Oh my gosh, right. But what people wear is very important. And you'll actually see this in Act 1, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet. We have these people that kind of represent two different families, and they're wearing different colors, and that's all very important because it's pointing out the differences between them. Any questions? Okay. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more fun. All right, so this is the game show, and then the name of the game show is it true or not? Would a person in Elizabethan England say this or believe this? So I'm going to give you the statement, and I just basically want you to tell me, would this be true or false for a person living in this time period? You may or may not know the answer. We're just guessing. So number 1 says, it is generally considered foolish to marry for love, although love may occur in marriage. Do you think people would believe this or not? True or false? Who says true?
That's true.
True? Okay. They might think false? Okay.
No, because back then they basically told you who you're marrying.
Yeah. Okay, you're right. It's true.
The men would claim a girl basically.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Worries.
So
Married
it's not really if
just
you even
ridiculous.
like
Why
them.
would you possibly do that? All right, so that's important. Because in Romeo and Juliet, we're going to find two people who fall in love. And that idea of love would have just been ridiculous. That's not even a thing. We don't even do that. If anything, you fall in love after you get married, if you're lucky. All right, so number 2, your parents and friends are better equipped than you are to look out for your best interests, being mature and experienced in the world. Let them negotiate and recommend, and you're much more likely to be happy in marriage.
True.
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 Okay, so your parents and your friends know better than you do and are more likely to pick out something good than you could.
Is this like back in the old times?
Yeah, in their time,
Back
would
then, yeah.
they believe this?
Back
True.
then.
Think so?
True.
Yes. Now, I'm just curious. I know we're only too deep in this, but do you think these things are still considered true today? Both of these?
No.
No.
I think most people.
Maybe by Amish people.
Not in our society, but I bet in other societies
Maybe a
today, they
little bit
probably
of
believe
two, but
this.
not one. Well, actually, one there's still a little bit because people marry for like wealth and money.
Sure. So I think you're good. It's good of you to acknowledge that, not all societies even today are the same as the one we're currently, talking in. However, definitely the notion of marriage for love is stupid and you have no idea what you want and it's better to let someone else pick for you. I think most people today would at least question that. But that very much was the way everybody believed then. All right, number 3. Arranged marriage means you've never met the other person before your engagement. What do we think? True or false in this time period?
False.
False.
Arranged marriage means you've never met the other person. Oh yeah, that's false. Well, back then
I think you could have met them.
They could be
Couldn't it be both?
Like,
you most likely have met them before, but they could just be like, you also might not have met them.
Okay, so you're right. Most of the time in Elizabethan England, and this is not true all the time everywhere, but in this time period in this part of the world, typically an arranged marriage meant that your parents told you who you were going to marry, but it was someone you already knew. It might be, your second cousin, or it might be, a neighbor, or, that guy who comes to dinner occasionally and lives the next town over. But typically when parents and friends, tried to set up these marriages, it was with someone you knew already. It just wasn't someone you necessarily had picked for yourself. So that is important. All right, 4, the lower on the social scale you are, meaning basically, are you nobility, are you middle class, are you poor? The lower you are on the social scale, the less likely you are to have a choice in the matter of who you marry.
False.
true.
I heard one emphatic false. Anybody think true?
I think
False.
true.
Wait, no, that's true.
Okay, not sure. All right. So actually, this is false. It worked the opposite way. The higher class you were, the less choice you had. Why might that be?
Gotta marry for money.
Yeah, because if you're arranging marriages for money and power and alliances and all of that, that's much more important to the upper class than it is to the lower class. The lower class didn't have a lot of choice anyway. If you came from a very poor family, there was probably very little chance you were going to be able to get somebody rich to marry your daughter. So maybe you didn't care so much if she wanted to pick someone for herself. If her choice is, a sheep farmer or, a goat farmer, then she can pick. I don't care. Right? Like, so it was actually the one advantage to being lower class in that you had more choice in who you spent your life with. You'll see in Romeo and Juliet are both from upper class families. So they have not as much control over themselves. All right. We have just a few more of these. Same game. Some women are more independent than others.
Randy, you stupid.
What's that?
Huh?
Okay. Some women are more independent than others and some fear marriage. Choosing not to marry means a woman must support herself for the duration of her life. Would that have been true in Elizabethan England?
Yes.
Probably.
Wasn't because she didn't marry, didn't she?
Who?
Queen Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, or the Queen Elizabeth, the first
Yeah.
one. She never married, right?
Right. Of course, she's the queen. She's kind of
I
unique,
know.
kind of do what she wants. Okay, so this is actually false. The first part might be kind of true. Some women don't want to marry. However, choosing not to marry for a woman didn't mean she would have to support herself. What it meant was she would then have to rely on the men in her own family to support her. She would not have had a way to support herself. That wouldn't be expected. So if you were a woman and you said, well, I'm not going to get married, that meant your dad, your brother, your uncle, they were responsible for you for the whole rest of your life. You didn't have another choice. And so a lot of women, even if they didn't want to get married, they would allow themselves to be married so that they would not be a burden on their families. They would do it almost as a sacrifice. All right, 6, if he is not noble, so if he's middle or lower class, a man must be married to become the legal head of a household and eligible to hold public or ecclesiastical office, meaning religious office, and other positions of civic responsibility.
False.
Anybody
Both.
heard one false? Both?
False. False.
This is actually true. So unless you're nobility, in order to sort of come into your full power as a man, you actually had to be married too. And I think this is important because we focus a lot on the fact that women are property and women don't have choices and all of that. But men actually didn't have a whole lot of choice either. They could choose who they wanted to marry, but they didn't really have the option to not marry unless they were nobility, unless they were perfectly fine with having no power. Marriage was seen as sort of a status symbol. And so most men were highly encouraged or forced even by their families to marry whether they wanted to or not. All right, 7, wives are the property of their husbands and give them the respect a servant gives his master or else.
True. At the time, right?
That's absolutely true. During this time period, that was the mentality. Within a relationship, it is possible you have men and women who didn't feel that way about each other, but as a society, this was the belief. And by the way, this was true of children as well. You were expected to give the head of the household, the father, the respect a servant gives his master. You did what you were told. You were seen as property as well. So children did not have the right to disrespect or question or defy their parents without there being consequences. That's the last one. When a man or woman is widowed, meaning their spouse dies, it is acceptable to remarry, especially if there are children. The traditional waiting period is 1 year.
True.
Yeah, false.
I think that's true.
All right, this is false. I'll tell you why. It is not acceptable to remarry. It is actually highly expected and almost required that you would get remarried if there were children there, for both genders. If there was a man and his wife died and there were no kids, he could probably do okay not remarrying if he didn't want to. But if he had children, he needed to get a second wife because who's going to take care of the kids? He wasn't going to do it. And if it was the other way around, if you had a husband die, then the woman needed to remarry, probably to be able to support herself. And if there were children, she absolutely needed to remarry. The other part of this that is false is the traditional waiting period was actually 1 month. That was considered the appropriate amount of time to wait before you got your next husband or wife. So why does that matter? We're not talking about widowing in this, but I think it's important to get the full picture of how people viewed marriage in this time period. It was really an arrangement. It had nothing to do with romance, nothing to do with love. It was really just about how do you get stuff done and make sure you're taken care of. Any questions or comments?
Nope.
Okay.
Interesting.
I think it's pretty interesting. All right, so this brings us to Romeo and Juliet. So just a few quick notes on the play. It is a tragedy with several comedic elements. We talked yesterday about how Shakespeare blends genres. It is officially a tragedy. It is absolutely fit the definition of a tragedy. However, as the play goes on, you'll see there are a lot of comedic elements. There are actually a lot of dirty jokes if you're paying attention and like that sort of thing. Lots of dirty jokes.
Yeah, they're kissing.
I know it's SpongeBob.
Yeah. There's a lot of, wordplay. There's just a lot of fun things going on in the play as well. This play was written very early in Shakespeare's career, which is pretty interesting because it is one of his most famous. We don't know exactly what order he wrote them in, but this was being produced in 1993, and he's really not a known name in England until 1992. So this is, probably one of the first 5 or 6 plays he wrote. So it's kind of an early example of his writing. It does borrow heavily from earlier versions of a similar story. So this is not 100% original story. And people sometimes criticize that. But the fact is, it's really hard to write an original story. I mean, most stories even today are not truly original. They're all pulling from something earlier. So there were a few different versions of Romeo and Juliet, or Romeo and Julietus, and they were in Italian or in Greek. He pulled from them and used elements from them, but he added a lot. He added a lot of extra characters and some subplots and some other things going on and made it a lot more complex. This play does have a lot of poetic elements, so we definitely want to at least notice some of those. There's some lovely poetry in terms of symbols and metaphors, but also the sound of the words, the rhymes and the meters that are used. So we'll look at some of that. And as I mentioned, this was among the most popular plays during Shakespeare's life. Like, people knew Romeo and Juliet and knew that Shakespeare was the one who wrote it, and it was performed a lot. And still is one of the most commonly performed and adapted today. There are tons of movies that are based off the story of Romeo and Juliet. I mentioned yesterday West Side Story, but you've got, probably SpongeBob episodes. You probably got, there's Romeo and Juliet. There was a movie back in the 90s called Romeo Must Die. There's tons and tons and tons of versions of this play. So this really strikes a chord with people. All right, so the last thing I'm gonna show you is kind of get you ready for the play. It's a bit of a character chart here. One thing I would highly encourage you to do is find a way in your own notes to maybe recreate this or make something like this. You don't have to do it right now, but even as you start reading or as we start talking about the play, and you find out how people are related to each other as we're reading, somehow visualize that, help you keep track of it. So one of the things you'll notice in the center of the screen, you have Romeo and Juliet. If you look on the left side of the screen, those are the people that are strongly associated with Romeo, and on the right are the people associated with Juliet. Lord and Lady Montague are the parents of Romeo. So he is a Montague. That's very important. That's his family, his house. Juliet is a Capulet. So Lord and Lady Capulet are her parents. So the Capulets and the Montagues do not like each other. They do not get along. Their entire households are sort of at odds with each other. And then you also have some friends and relatives around. You will first meet in the play Romeo and his friend Mercutio and his cousin Benvolio. The 3 of them will be the first major characters that you meet. Later, we will meet Juliet, who her closest friend and confidant is the nurse who has taken care of her entire life. if the more you study this image, you'll see there are a lot of parallels. Both on both sides, Romeo and Juliet both have at least one really trusted friend, and they both have a cousin that's important to them. They both have a servant who plays an important role on each side. In addition to that, you see there are actually some points of connection between the two families, aside from Romeo and Juliet. You may not remember this, and that's okay. I'm just going to point you back to it later. Romeo's best friend, Mercutio, is related to Prince Atlas, who is also related to Count Paris, who is the person that Lord and Lady Capulet want Juliet to marry. So before Romeo and Juliet ever even meet, they have these kind of two-level connections to each other. And the reason I point that out is we focus a lot in the play on the Capulets versus the Montagues. They are at odds with each other. But there are already people who are kind of in between these two families and don't have issues with either of them, and actually maybe love both of them. So that's going to be kind of important to keep in mind. Again, this is something, at least for reference, I wanted you to visualize. There are a few other minor characters that aren't mentioned here, but you want to think about and keep it straight as you're reading. Who are Romeo's people and who are Juliet's people? Because that's going to help the drama and the interactions that happen make a lot more sense if you can remember kind of who is who and who they're connected with. Are there any questions about this?
No, it's pretty simple.
Okay.
You just gotta listen.
Okay. So I know you guys have read a little Shakespeare before, but I think it's useful to wrap your head around as much as possible, at least the main characters, before you start to read. Because Shakespeare uses a lot of characters. You guys remember in Medea, Greek drama, how many actors would we have on stage at a time in Greek drama?
2 or 3.
Remember? Three was the most you would have at one time. So in Shakespeare, that kind of that's thrown out the window, right? You could have 8 characters on stage at one time. And a typical play company, a typical troupe of actors would have 8 to 12 actors in it. A typical Shakespeare play has 15 to 20 characters in it, which means most of the actors are still playing multiple roles. The major roles would not share, but you'd have one actor maybe playing 2 different servants or something like that. So there are a lot more names and a lot more people on stage at a time, typically in Shakespeare. So having a mental image of kind of who is helpful. All right. Any questions?
Yeah, ma'am.
And I know it's not as much fun to have information just thrown at you, but that's the necessary backloading so that hopefully the play is going to make a lot more sense.